That radio looks like it belongs in a museum, not a memorial service. The young sergeant barely glanced up from his clipboard. His tone was sharp, mechanical, like he'd said it 100 times already that morning. Thomas Kim didn't flinch. He simply stood there, headphones around his neck, the breeze catching the edge of his coat. He wore his old dress uniform, worn, pressed, and faded with time. In his hands, held with reverent care, was a vintage military radio. Call sign Angel Radio, still visible in white stencil. The same radio his wife had helped him restore just weeks before the stroke took her. It was the only thing he ever let anyone else touch. One of the younger officers smirked. "Sir, this is a closed memorial. Aircrew only. You need clearance to step inside." Thomas said nothing. He simply adjusted the radio with trembling hands and stepped away from the entrance. He stood just beyond the doorway, back straight, boots together, eyes fixed on the memorial photos beyond the glass doors. He wasn't here to disrupt. He was here to say goodbye. If you believe no voice should ever be silenced, type honor below. Every story deserves to be heard. Thomas stayed where he was, just outside the Memorial Hall entrance. The morning sun climbed slowly behind him, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor inside. His posture didn't falter, even with the tremor in his hands. Even as officers in dress blues walked past him without a glance. A few attendees showed their credentials and were waved through. One or two glanced his way, a flicker of confusion, maybe pity, but no one stopped. A photographer adjusted his lens and turned deliberately in another direction. Inside, rows of chairs filled quickly with families, fellow airmen, and dignitaries. Black and white photographs of fallen pilots lined the walls. A podium stood ready for eulogies that would never mention the voice that brought them home. Thomas looked down at the identification badge clipped to his chest. It wasn't current. It wasn't digital. Just a faded plastic rectangle with a photograph taken 30 years ago, laminated and cracked. His name, his unit, his discharge status, communications specialist. He offered it again to the same sergeant. The young man didn't even touch it. "Sir, that's not valid anymore. This memorial is for the Mogadishu 40. "I know who they are," Thomas said softly, his voice carrying that strange quality, calm, steady, the kind that cut through chaos. "I was their lifeline. Name of your unit?" "Radio Communications, 5th Special Operations Squadron." The sergeant tapped at his tablet. "Says here communications personnel weren't deployed with aircrew on that mission." Thomas nodded once. "That's correct." "I wasn't there." The sergeant looked up with annoyance. "Then what?" "I was here, 72 hours, no sleep, guiding them home." But what the sergeant didn't know, what no one in that memorial hall knew, was that every single name on those photographs had heard Thomas Kim's voice in their darkest moment. Every pilot who made it back alive had followed the calm instructions of a man they'd never seen, a voice they'd never forget, a voice that had promised, "I'll stay with you until you're home." The sergeant stepped back with visible irritation. "I'm sorry, sir. Without proper clearance, we can't make exceptions. Communication support isn't the same as—" "I understand," Thomas said quietly. He stepped back again and waited. A gust of wind swept across the memorial grounds, rattling the flags. The edge of his coat lifted, revealing the worn leather strap of an old field radio still clipped to his belt. He pressed the fabric down gently. One of the officers near the entrance leaned toward a colleague and whispered something under his breath. The other laughed quietly. Thomas heard it. He didn't turn. Instead, he looked through the glass doors again, through the crowd already assembling, toward the wall of photographs. He had seen those faces before, not in pictures, but in his mind's eye as their voices crackled through static at 3 in the morning. Young men calling for help in voices that shook with fear and exhaustion. "Angel Radio, this is Hawk 27. We're taking heavy fire. Can't see the LZ. Please. We need guidance." He wasn't here for recognition. He was here because he remembered, and because somewhere in that perfect memorial hall were the families of men who had whispered, "Thank you, Angel," into their radios as they touched down safely at base. A group of younger airmen passed by, laughing and adjusting their ceremonial swords. One of them noticed Thomas standing there and paused. "Hey, what's with the old guy and the museum piece?" The others chuckled. The one who spoke looked closer and pointed at the radio in Thomas's hands. "What is that thing? Does it even work?" Thomas didn't answer. He raised one trembling hand to adjust the headphones around his neck, then folded both hands around the radio, left steady, right shaking, and stared forward, still, like a sentinel too dedicated to abandon his post. But what these young airmen didn't understand was that the museum piece in Thomas's hands had been the only thing standing between 40 American aircrew and certain death. For 72 hours straight, through equipment failures, enemy jamming, and his own physical exhaustion, Thomas Kim had been their guardian angel, the voice they trusted when they couldn't trust anything else. The sun was higher now, casting sharp light through the Memorial Hall's glass walls. Inside, the service had begun. Thomas could hear the first notes of Amazing Grace faintly through the doors, the kind of distant melody that makes you straighten your spine whether anyone's watching or not. He didn't move. Not when the honor guard presented arms, not when the first speaker took the podium, and not when the boys returned. The same group of young airmen wandered back toward the entrance, restless, unsupervised, trading glances with one another. One of them carried a program from the memorial, glossy, folded neatly. Another snapped photos on his phone, casual, disrespectful. They slowed when they saw Thomas still standing there, still waiting, still silent. "Man," one of them muttered, "he hasn't moved. That's dedication or dementia." The others laughed. The tallest among them, early 20s maybe, stepped a little closer. His boots scraped the concrete. He pointed at the radio. "Angel Radio, what's that supposed to mean, old man?" Thomas didn't respond. "You actually think that thing saved lives?" he asked, leaning in. "Looks like it came from a garage sale." Another round of soft laughter, not cruel, but careless. That made it worse. The airman reached out, 2 fingers only, and tapped the radio's antenna like it was a toy from a hobby shop. The metal chimed softly. Thomas's hands tightened instinctively around the radio, not defensive, not aggressive, just protective. Then he looked the young man in the eyes, not angry, not hurt, just steady. The airman's smirk faded. He stepped back. No one said a word. No one intervened. A nearby officer glanced over, saw everything, and turned back to his conversation. But what that young airman had just touched wasn't a toy. It was the instrument that had carried 40 voices home through the longest night of Thomas Kim's life. Every frequency adjustment, every signal boost, every calm instruction had been filtered through that radio, including the voice of a young pilot who had cried, "Angel Radio, if you're still there, I don't think we're going to make it." Thomas had stayed there for 72 hours, without sleep, without relief, without anyone knowing his name. Across the field, the memorial continued. Names were being read aloud. Stories were being shared about courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Cameras clicked. Dignitaries nodded. Thomas remained outside, unacknowledged, uninvited. A moment later, the group drifted away. One of them muttered something under his breath about wannabe heroes. Another snorted. Thomas sat down slowly on a concrete bench near the wall, his legs stiff from standing. He placed the radio beside him carefully. The vintage headphones made a quiet sound as they settled against the stone. He exhaled, a long, tired breath, and then reached up to the headphones around his neck. He lifted them with care. His hands trembled slightly as he examined the worn leather, pressing his fingers along the cracks like they were something sacred. Because they were. The padding was compressed from years of use. The adjustment strap had been replaced twice, but every hour of wear had been earned. Every crack told the story of a night when sleep wasn't an option, and 40 lives hung in the balance. He stared at them, then placed them gently over his ears, for just a moment, like he was listening for voices that would never come again. No cameras caught that moment, no one applauded, no one even noticed. Except one man. A general, standing quietly near the memorial entrance, had been watching the entire time. His uniform was crisp, multiple stars gleaming on his collar. He didn't speak, didn't approach. He turned and walked toward the security checkpoint. Thomas remained seated, not slumped, not defeated, just still. The headphones rested around his neck again, close to his heart. He kept a hand over the radio, steady, not shaking, as if protecting something alive. The sounds of the memorial floated faintly from inside the hall. Muffled eulogies, ceremonial music, the sharp echo of boots turning in synchronized formation. But out here, outside the doors, there was only silence and memory. Thomas shifted slightly on the concrete bench. His back ached. He didn't show it. Instead, he reached down and straightened the crease on his uniform trousers. He wiped a bit of dust from the radio's antenna. Then he picked up his cap and placed it carefully on his head. And he stood, slowly, deliberately, back to attention. No one told him to. No one was watching. But he stood as if someone was, as if his wife might be. As if Lieutenant Marcus Sullivan, the pilot whose voice had broken through the static 30 years ago, could still hear the man who had talked him through a sandstorm with no visibility and a damaged compass. He remembered the way Sullivan's voice had cracked that night, not from static, but from relief. "Angel radio, I can see the base. I can see home." "Copy that, Hawk Leader, welcome back." Thomas never said goodbye over the radio, but he always said welcome back. Thomas turned now, facing the memorial wall visible through the glass. His eyes didn't squint. They stared, wide and clear. The breeze caught the antenna of his radio. This time he let it sway, and then, with no audience, no microphone, no order given, he spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. "Angel radio to all stations. This is your final check. All birds accounted for. All souls home safe." It wasn't a prayer to the dead. It was a report to the living, a confirmation that the mission was complete. At that exact moment, inside the memorial hall, the general who had watched from afar stepped onto the stage. His boots were polished, his posture upright, but his voice was low when he spoke into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, careful not to interrupt the planned program, "before we continue, there's someone outside who needs to be here." The crowd turned, confused. The family members in the front row looked puzzled, but the general's eyes, sharp, experienced, were focused on something else. 30 years ago, 40 American aircrew were trapped in hostile territory during the Battle of Mogadishu. Weather was impossible. Communications were jammed, and for 72 hours, one man stayed at his radio, without sleep, without relief, talking us through the darkness. There was a pause, a stirring in the audience. And then the general said one name, not a rank, not a title. "Angel radio." The reaction was immediate. Veterans in the audience straightened, family members gasped, and from the back of the hall, an older man in civilian clothes stood up. "That's the voice that saved my son," he said, his own voice shaking. Another stood, and mine, then another. "My brother made it home because of Angel radio." General Marcus Sullivan, the same pilot whose voice had cracked through static 3 decades ago, nodded slowly, not like an officer giving a briefing, but like a man remembering the moment his life was saved by a stranger's dedication. "He's standing outside right now," Sullivan said, "because someone told him communications personnel don't belong at aircrew memorials." The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was ashamed. Sullivan didn't wait for protocol. He handed his ceremonial notes to an aide, stepped down from the podium, and walked straight toward the entrance. Straight toward Thomas Kim. The crowd followed, not in formation, not in order, but in recognition. They poured through the doors, across the memorial plaza, toward the concrete bench where Thomas Kim stood at attention with his vintage radio. General Sullivan stopped just inches from Thomas. He didn't salute immediately. He looked first, fully, deeply, at the man before him, the man with trembling hands, The man whose uniform was pressed but outdated. The man who had stood without permission, without clearance, for over 2 hours. Then, without a word, Sullivan extended his hand, not in command, not for show, but in gratitude. "I heard you wouldn't come," he said quietly, "but I made them promise. If you showed up, you had to be recognized." Thomas blinked, the sunlight catching his face. Recognized for what? Sullivan turned slightly and gestured behind him. The entire memorial service had moved outside. 400 people, all looking at him. "For keeping your promise," Sullivan said. "You told us you'd stay with us until we were home." Thomas's voice was thin, cracked. "I thought you'd forgotten." Sullivan shook his head, eyes serious. "Sergeant Kim, you're the reason 40 families didn't get folded flags that week. The reason 40 pilots made it back to see their children grow up." He paused, then leaned in closer. "And I'm the reason my granddaughter will never have to wonder if her grandfather was brave." Thomas looked down at the radio in his hands. His fingers steadied slightly. Behind them, the entire assembly stood in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. And when Thomas turned toward the memorial wall, Sullivan moved beside him. Not in front, not behind, but shoulder to shoulder. Together they walked, through the doors, into the hall, toward the wall of photographs. The crowd parted silently. Some saluted. Some simply placed hands over their hearts. Thomas carried the radio like he had carried his vigil, not for recognition, but because it was right. Sullivan leaned slightly and said, just above a whisper, "Tom, I need you to know, every pilot here that day, we all heard your voice break on hour 68, when you thought we couldn't hear you anymore." Thomas didn't answer. He just walked. And in that moment, the silence became sacred. If you believe some voices save lives without ever being seen, subscribe now. This is how we honor the guardians who serve in shadows. The final steps felt shorter than they were. Thomas walked steadily, the radio secure in his arms. The tremor in his hands had stopped. The memorial hall felt warm, filled with faces that finally understood. He didn't hear the whispers anymore, didn't notice the cameras, the rows of families, the brass insignias catching light like stars of recognition. All he saw was the wall of photographs up ahead, 40 faces that had once been voices in the night. And beside him, General Sullivan walked in silence, matching pace. Halfway through the hall, Thomas noticed them. The same young airmen who had mocked earlier, now standing at rigid attention, not ordered, not forced. Each of them with their heads lifted, eyes forward. And as Thomas passed, one of them, the one who had touched the radio, stepped out slightly and whispered, "Sir, I didn't know. I'm sorry." Thomas didn't stop, but he nodded. And in that moment, the apology carried more weight than the insult ever had. They reached the memorial wall. Thomas stepped forward, placed the radio on the marble ledge beneath the photographs, and removed his cap. He pressed his palm against the wall, then stepped back. No applause, no ceremony, just recognition. And then a rustle among the ranks. Veterans throughout the crowd, scattered, unplanned, stood slowly. Some raised hands in salute, others removed their hats. One man clutched his walker and stood without support, legs shaking. A woman in dress blues, silver hair tucked under her beret, stood tall and whispered, "Thank you, Angel." Thomas blinked, not because of the light, but because he hadn't expected it. Not this, not ever. The memorial concluded differently than planned. No speeches about strategy or tactics. Instead, 40 families came forward, one by one, to shake the hand of the man whose voice had brought their loved ones home. When it ended, General Sullivan turned toward Thomas. "I know you didn't want recognition," he said quietly. Thomas glanced down. It was never about being heard. "I know," Sullivan replied, "but some voices deserve to be remembered." 1 hour later, as the last chairs were folded and the guests dispersed, a small group remained near the memorial wall. They gathered around a new addition, a simple bronze plaque mounted beside the 40 photographs. It read, "In honor of Technical Sergeant Thomas Kim, Angel Radio, Because some heroes guide from the shadows, and their voices echo long after the static fades. No statue, no podium, just truth. Thomas didn't speak. He stood beside the wall, fingers brushing the cold marble. Then from his coat pocket, he pulled out a small piece of paper. His wife's handwriting, faded but legible. A note she'd slipped into his pocket the night she helped him restore the radio. For the voice that brings them home. He folded it carefully and placed it beneath the radio on the memorial ledge. A gesture no one told him to make, but one that said more than words ever could. Sullivan stepped up beside him. "They'll remember this," Thomas said. Sullivan nodded. "They already are." Thomas turned to go. No speeches. No waves. Just quiet steps toward the exit. This time, when people saw him, they didn't stare. They stood, because some voices fade, but some echoes never do. If you typed honor earlier, thank you. If you subscribed, welcome. And if this story moved you in any way, remember this: the guardians in the shadows deserve to be seen. See you in the next one.